Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, I want to conclude our little two-part series on the high-end red glass build thought process, where I already in part one, which will be linked down below, and it's very much recommended if you haven't watched that one to maybe watch that one before this one, because it'll be moving on from where basically that one left off. And where that one did leave off is that we went through and picked our build basically of how to basically get a glass red together, picking that we wanted to go glass, what talents we could kind of use, what brands we kind of could use. And we got basically to the point where with simple calculations, we still got a decent enough result. And ended it basically before we needed to go into spreadsheeting and such, or some more major calculations basically, to really figure out what would be the preferred choices, and maybe even using the word optimal choices. And yeah, we'll move on into that. And this video as well will be quite spreadsheet heavy. I will try to incorporate some timestamps as we move through the video. Just so we can jump around. I'll try to keep it not as long as the last part, as we'll mostly basically be ending up comparing what are choices that are left, especially with contractors, trying to fit that in, what our choices kind of can be, and numbers-wise how it works out. So yeah, let's move on to the build first. And here is the main build, although not the exact same one, because for the first part, we were actually on my alt, because I wanted to start off with some gray pieces, which I don't have on my main account. And we went through and we did get a decent setup together. I've replicated that setup basically. The major parts of it were basically that we went with a main AR, rifle secondary. We went with 3 pieces of Providence, 1 piece of Grupo, 1 piece of Fox, 1 piece of Fenris, and then a Fox's Prayer. And on one of the pieces, in this case, this Fenris glove, I chose weapon handling. And in there as well, I was using a grade 23 FAMAS, which I have here as well, of course, on my main account. Although for the first, starting off with the calculations a little bit, I'm going to actually move us back to an ungraded FAMAS, just because I didn't actually have one on my alt account, because all the FAMASs there are graded to at least 10, which is the first world problems, I know. And we were very much still interested, because yeah, the Fox, we made it make sense basically by explaining what the stat was, how active we expect it to be, and that we would even use its primary bonus for our secondary weapon choice, which we'll likely sometimes use to reach out and touch someone. And then we basically set it up with this weapon handling roll, landing on 59, 183 crit damage. And actually, the first thing that I kind of want to discuss here, because there is, of course, another option we could go with to not exceed the crit cap, but actually hit it exactly, and still have basically the pieces as we have them here. And this is, of course, what a lot of people do go for, and that's actually what we'll be using in most of the calculations. And I left it basically out because I went fast and it was a rambling talk. These aren't scripted. I have some notes that I want to hit. I have a spreadsheet basically at the ready that I'm going to go through in a second. And in such, they are sometimes not perfect in the way that I would want them. Because if we were to swap this crit chance, of course, and and then we would be basically at 65 with 3 crit chance mods on the weapon. But what we then have the option to do, of course, is to either go the stability mod, which a lot of people choose to do. I prefer that weapon handling roll, and that's why I went with that weapon handling roll. But we, of course, also have the option of going 5 crit damage here. And this 5 crit damage isn't, of course, the worst choice we have. We're pretty high on crit damage already, so it's not close to that 5 at all. But it's still an increase. If we are going for all-out damage, as was kind of the intention as I laid it out at the start with the glass, then this makes sense. And we are going to actually pick it. And this is also going to be basically now as it is, although with a crit chance mod here, or a crit chance roll here instead of this weapon handling, putting us at, we are now at 54. We would be at 60, 188 if I had the piece set already here, which I don't. But we'll take it through the calculations like that. Also, of note, we're leaving out a Coyote for now. And basically the expectation of this build is that somebody else is going to run the Coyote, and this will benefit. Because yeah, if we want to put in a Coyote, there are many ways to do it. One easy way actually is to just even take out one more crit chance mod to a crit damage mod, leaving a hole for the mid-range one, swapping this Grupo over to it, and Bob's your uncle. Let's move on to the calculation sheet as I have it prepared for today. It isn't as long, as it's mostly repeating stuff a little bit once we get going in it. And it is at the ready here, of course. So, of course, we'll be linking everything down below as well. And if you haven't seen this before, these are multi-calculators of my design. If you are interested in how to fill them in and such, there's a video on my channel that explains them a little bit. And if you are just interested for now, all you really need to know is that output happens up here, input happens down here. They're basically repeating segments of this, where we're comparing up to 10 builds. Each row is a build, and everything, unless otherwise stated and usually otherwise colored, is comparing in its burst and sustain DPS, which are the main values we're getting out of here, against the build at the top, or if there's basically a gray section, which will later on, it'll be split up basically in multiple calculators in one calculator, just to save on some space. And here what I have to start off with is basically the three options that I showed there with the FAMAS, which is that either we go a 5 crit damage mod on the weapon itself, or we go with a weapon handling rule on a piece, in my case, the Fenris glove, and it's specifically on the glove, of course, because contractors would exactly match it in stat-wise. It would have a damage to armor plus crit damage. The Fenris glove that I had there would have weapon handling rule and crit damage. So they are basically interchangeable. That's why it's set up there. We have the 20 stability one, which is basically, numbers-wise, of course, basically the same, although you're only getting stability. I prefer to have accuracy especially as well, which weapon handling provides, and also that reload speed, because also I'm altering this reload speed to match actually given in-game numbers, and that's adding up to a little bit higher sustain. And this fourth one is what if instead of that Grupo piece, we had a Walker and Harris, and that's just for in a little bit. And then we'll move on to the other sections. But let's first start off with, yeah, indeed, if we have that 5 crit damage mod, we end, as we see here, on 60, 188. If we're going with that weapon handling, we'll end up at 59 because we're swapping a 6 for a 5, so we're losing one, and 183. If we're taking the stability one, giving us only stability, we're still landing on 60, of course, because yeah, the gear still has that 6 crit chance, and then 183, so basically just 1 crit chance better. And between those three, just to start off, we'll leave the Walker and Harris for in a second, because that one is just to show a little point. If we take these three numbers, especially on the burst, of course, that 5 crit damage mod is basically increasing our output by a little bit. It is not that full 5, basically, because, of course, we're diminishing it because we're already so high. We're getting less return per point, basically, because we're so high on crit damage, especially on a high-end glass red like we have here. And percentage-wise, we can see that actually that weapon handling, if I go with the weapon handling one, we're losing about in this case, 2.27%. So it is beyond, I usually say around 2% is something that you can kind of feel in gameplay. This is beyond that, of course, already. Although, of course, you're also going to feel that 8 weapon handling. At least I quite noticeably feel the difference between having that weapon handling and not. And that's mostly because as well, the first few points that you get into weapon handling, especially, for instance, the watch, not having the watch, that 10 accuracy, 10 stability, for instance, when I play watch alts or when I'm playing on my World Tier 5 character, which doesn't have a watch, it's actually quite noticeable how much of a big difference that first 10 make. And weapon handling kind of, just by its design, not by it actual calculation-wise, it is decreasing it less and less per point, the average grouping size. It is just because of it being additive as well. So the first few points give the biggest effect, and then the more and more and more you try to put weapon handling into build, the less effect it kind of feels it has. So then we can see actually that the weapon handling one, because we're altering that reload speed with weapon handling as well, is actually sustaining a little bit better. And this is the reason why I kind of don't mind with that weapon handling one. Of course, the sustain is very far in. You will never basically hit a sustain number. It is very far in the future. Basically, you would have to, I believe, I calculated once on a FAMAS like this, you need to, for the 50% to get between burst and sustain, it was 33 mags. You have to unload 33 mags in a row before you're halfway between burst and sustain damage, like average damage numbers wise. It is a very annoying calculation, and that's also why I'm not backing that up with the calculation here. But in the future, likely we will look at those kinds of things as well, because yeah, that of course shifts per weapon because of the reload speed, the firing time and such. Those alter that value basically. So that's also not a given for every weapon. And also, of course, how much weapon handling you have, for instance, reducing reloads and stuff. With the 20 stab one, we can see that is actually landing a little bit higher, of course, because yeah, we have basically one crit chance more. That's the difference between those two, is you have one crit chance more. So yeah, you see that reflected in the numbers. And yeah, one crit chance more is actually making a lot of difference here, of course. And then it doesn't have that weapon handling to alter its reload. So on sustain, it's actually landing lower. But I much prefer, especially as I said, accuracy is much more of an issue for me on the FAMAS than stability, I feel. I can handle the FAMAS decently well with just the watch points, really. And a little bit more accuracy makes it the grouping a little bit more handleable. And then if we move on, of course, there is always the thing of we don't put Walker and Harris in these kinds of builds. So actually, if I take us back in the game, this is basically going, what if we take either this Grupo piece or this Providence piece? Because yeah, altering the Fenris one to be Walker and Harris doesn't make sense, to one-piece Walker and Harris, because of course you're just basically halving that 10 assault rifle damage to just 5 all-weapon damage bonus, because they're additive to each other, so they're in the same pool anyway. So what if we take one of these Grupo or this Providence piece out, and of course we already know it's going to be lower, but by how much is it lower? If we go back in, we can see that it's basically the same as that weapon handling roll almost. And this is the reason why we don't put Walker and Harris in builds, at least not in one piece, unless you're doing something with that weapon damage. So for instance, in Headhunter build, which is using weapon damage as one of its primary calculation stats, or with Pestilence, for instance, where it is scaling off of weapon damage specifically and not crit damage and such, then you can kind of make it make sense. But this is the reason, for instance, that we don't put Walker and Harris in there. And this is also the reason that we kind of use burst and sustain as our comparison tools, because we can put the numbers in. And of course, you would only really need this average number to compare it on the build side. But what burst and sustain then provide us is also we can alter weapons. And we're going to do that in a second. And that's really all they are for, burst and sustain. You can use them as a comparison point. And especially on a build like this, the 5 crit damage mod one and this Walker and Harris one. So the other ones have, for instance, the weapon handling one has, of course, a weapon handling, improving the weapon a little bit. The stab one has stability, improving the weapon a little bit. But the difference between this 5 crit damage mod one and this Walker and Harris one is nothing. They play the exact same, because stat-wise, it's just basically just a little bit different stats. And especially there, stuff like using burst to compare two builds together is where their strength is. And that's why we use burst for instance, here. But you always have to be aware that the second, basically between this one, of course, at the top with the 5 crit damage mod, and I'm going to this weapon handling mod one, we are giving up burst, but we're giving it up for a reason in this case. And this is also basically the way that I run the build. I run it with that one weapon handling mod. I'm willing to give up this little bit of damage for that little bit of extra weapon handling on the build. And the important thing is always to actually make informed decisions. So by calculating it out, we get to see what the difference is and go, am I willing to give this up to go with that piece? For instance, here as well, if I was a somewhat newer player and I did have that Walker and Harris piece at full, but I didn't have a Grupo or Providence piece at full, fully maximized on their stats, we could put in the numbers and actually compare them and get an actual answer. Because if you have a Walker and Harris holster, let's say, which is maxed out, God rolled, you just got lucky and got it, would that maybe be better than a Providence piece, which is halfway and it came with, let's say, armor regen and health, and you roll the health off for a crit damage? Is that better? Well, you can use a burst. Well, actually, you can just use average damage. If it's just a build, you can use average damage to just compare it, as long as there's also no weapon handling differences, because those, of course, go into the reload, and then you have to do sustain. But yeah, these calculators are set up for that, is very much to just compare builds. And then the person interpreting it has to do it right, basically. Because yeah, if we compare, for instance, a striker versus a glass, the striker has to stack, it plays completely differently, it has more weapon handling though, so it has a much better feeling weapon. And there's where burst and sustain becomes much more about how do you interpret it. How do you interpret it, or how do you, what does the person interpreting it for you, in this case, for instance, me, go by? Because yeah, I could be very much biased, of course. I could be in the pocket of Providence and trying to sell you to buy more Providence, for instance. Now here, one of the things I wanted to touch on is that, of course, instead of that 5 crit damage mod, there are weapon choices. For instance, here the M4 and the F2000, or the Carbine 7 and the Honey Badger, where we could go 2 crit chance mods and a crit damage mod, or go 2 crit chance mod and the F2000, for instance. And actually, this might surprise a lot of people, because I know this for a long time, but also every time I try to put it out there, people kind of backlash against it. So for instance, here especially, I'm going to grab the Carbine 7 one for example first. So what happens basically, let me take us back into the game. If we go between this Carbine 7, and I'll set it up with a 2 crit chance mods and a crit damage mod. We'll put a Contractors in as well, just instead of this one already. So what if we have, yes, this Carbine 7, with 2 crit chance and crit damage, or we have a Honey Badger with the same stats with 2 crit chance mods. So they're both matching on crit chance. So in this case, 54 with both of them, leaving a hole for Contractors. So this would be a setup for to-go Contractors, for instance. Or if you had that Fenris piece with crit chance, then you would be at 59 for if you're running this solo, for instance. And what is the difference between these two weapons? So one of them, of course, has a higher base damage, so their total damage is a little bit higher, as you see here. They both get receiving the same bonuses, but basically we're pitting this extra increase in base damage against a 5 crit damage mod. So that's important to have a note of here, because we're going to come to a conclusion here. And that is, if we go back to here, so this is this Carbine 7 versus the Honey Badger as they're set up there, as we showed them. Now, of course, stat-wise, the nice thing between the Carbine 7 and the Honey Badger is that they're basically the same gun. They are just, there's a little bit of difference in felt recoil, because the Honey Badger is almost as if it has an accuracy mod on it as its barrel mod. And it, of course, has a little bit higher base damage, which is reflected there. We can see that actually the Honey Badger wins out. And this might surprise a lot of people. If you at this moment are running a 2 crit chance, 1 crit damage mod, Carbine 7, technically you are better off with Honey Badger. And the same is actually true as well between the M4 and the F2000. Although, of course, the M4 and the F2000, they share an RPM. They don't share the same reload speed. The M4 is a little bit more accurate. The F2000 is a little bit more stable. And there we can see as well that the F2000 actually comes a little bit out ahead if you're using 2 crit chance mods and 1 crit damage mod on the M4. But of course, what you have the option with those weapons is to go 3 crit chance mods. And when you're pitting it against a crit chance mod that is being used effectively, for instance, let's say Striker, which you want to have those 3 crit chance mods definitely, then they don't win, of course. This is only against crit damage that they win. And making them viable options, actually, when you're setting them up as that. But of course, what I much more prefer is to have 2 crit chance mods or 3 crit chance mods on the weapon and a weapon handling roll on the gear itself. So that's usually what I go with by my choices. But these are viable choices, and you also have to always kind of calculate it out like this, because this balance, of course, shifts a little bit depending on your balance of crit damage, especially because, for instance, on Striker, where you're landing around 140-ish on an Obliterate Striker, or even lower with a pristine example Striker, then that 5 is going to outcompete against that base damage increase. So it's very reliant on build. And that is always the annoying thing with calculations within Division, is as the second you shift one thing, you basically have to recalculate everything. Now, having discussed all this, let's move on to actually the question that we ended on was where, how much, because yeah, that is still kind of the question with high-end reds, although, of course, they've become a little bit less relevant with Strikers around, and other options like Heartbreaker and Umbra as well competing with them. But the question of contractors to contractor or not to contractor, and let's go answer that. And actually, before we move on, because I rewatched that segment and I forgot one important thing, and that is, so we have these other weapons, of course, but the FAMAS, we are also still comparing here against the FAMAS at the top here. We can see that the M4 and the Carbine are very much behind the FAMAS still on their burst and their sustain as well, of course. The FAMAS is very much an outlier. It is that much of an outlier that it is worth learning. And the FAMAS, of course, does not really have a comparative gun with only 2 crit chance, or well, 2 slots where you could have crit chance or crit damage in there. So that's why also this is basically only a point. What that matters if you are using M4s and carbines, and you should at points, because of course you have the long rail for flatline, making them the choice for those kinds of times. But yeah, the FAMAS is very much in its own league. I just wanted to point that out, and why we also aren't, for instance, going for a different weapon where we have 1 mod less and getting higher base damage as we have with the carbines and such, because there is no equivalent for that for the FAMAS. Now if we move on to this second one, and this one I've mostly just used to input the stats as we have them here. And this is comparing the 5 crit damage mod version that we had, so with the Fenris glove with crit chance crit damage, and then altogether trying to go for maximum output. The weapon handling one, which is actually my recommended one really, where we're giving up a little bit of the damage, we're gaining a little bit of weapon handling back for it. We're keeping 3 crit chance mods on the weapon at that point as well, landing on 59,183. And then we have 2 versions of the Contractors. What if we swap in a Contractors, and then what if it's, first of all, here with no Fenris, so it's replacing the Fenris piece, and then the second calculations with Grupo as being the replaced part, and Grupo, of course, is the same as the third piece, Providence. Both of them share the same stats. Now, if we, so the top line is DTH, and the bottom line is DTA, as it goes here, and yeah, so on the first one, we have, of course, these 2 versions don't have DTH or DTA. They have only DTH from the weapon. And of course, the Contractors one are gaining 8 DTA. And they're going here, especially not, of course, in the way we want to compare them, because, yeah, they're going up and down, because this was just to input the stats. In a second, we'll move on to comparing them outright. But what we can already see actually here is if we just compare the burst numbers of for instance, this Grupo one at the end, we can see that it is much lower than the burst DPS, of course, than the 5 crit damage mod version, but it is a little bit higher on the DTA number that it has here. And if we then actually move on to this third one, because here it's a lot more clearer, because I made that one first just to input the stats, and then it became clear that it's much easier to put all of the DTHs together, compare those together, and then all of the DTAs together. And then here where it's going gray, we're basically using this as a second multi-calculator, where these percentages are now within this gray section comparing to this one at the top. And then we're combining them back in this final section here, and I'll discuss that in a second. But first off, if we take the DTH numbers, especially, of course, here with this 3 at the top, it's with that, and then so contractors replacing the Fenris or contractors replacing the Grupo. Here we can see as well already that contractors replacing the Fenris on this specific layout, of course, because this is very much dependent on the balance between crit damage and weapon damage. If you're running a build with several more blue builds, it might be beneficial to keep, or a blue course, it will be beneficial to keep the Fenris piece and then drop the Grupo piece for contractors, or of course, for instance, in PvP kind of setups where you're going multiple blue cores, or if you just want to have a few blue cores. So this isn't universal. It isn't universal that it should be that contractors replaces the Fenris piece, but with this all-out damage version where we're going for the highest stats possible, basically, we want the contractors to replace the Fenris, and we can see that just by these burst calculations. And again, that's really what burst is really there for, because these 3, of course, they play the exact same. There is no actual gameplay difference. One of them does a little bit more DTH, the other ones do a little bit more DTA, but none of them have differences in weapon handling or such, for instance. So they play the exact same, so these numbers then become the metric to compare them by. Then if we move on to the section where we have DTA, of course, the contractors wins out. And this is very much, of course, just a test of does wasting a brand bonus, because we're not using that LMG damage bonus, of course, from contractors, does wasting that make up for the 8 DTA that contractors provides? And we can see that, yes, it does. Because versus a setup without contractors, with Fenris, or, in this case, with Fenris, and then without Fenris, and then the contractors in its place, we can see that on the DTA end of it is a little bit ahead by 1.1%. And that is, of course, not that big of a number. But if we were to, for instance, compare it to what I actually run, which is a Fenris piece with that weapon handling role, this difference is, of course, then greater, and then it matches up a little bit better. But then you have to basically, they play differently because one has weapon handling role. But if we're just going all out damage, we're concerned about damage. What is our best setup? We can see then that together, the DTA and DTH, we would have to kind of combine them into a number and give them a ratio. And that's exactly, of course, what I'm doing in this last part. We've only taken the contractors replacing the Fenris from the contractor section, because we know now the Grupo, replacing the Grupo, at least on this specific build, is the worst choice. So we're replacing the Fenris. That is the better version of the two, so that's the one I've picked. And then against the 5 crit damage mod one, with a Fenris, giving up, not having just DTH, not having DTA, basically. We can see that if we pick, and then here I've set it up with having, I can pick a number for DTH. It'll basically fill in the DTA just as the rest of the percentage, basically. It's taking the average, an average number by having, basically, if I have it here set at 40% DTH, 60% DTA, which is kind of my guess for general gameplay, is around those numbers, basically. We can see that then we're taking basically 40% of this DTH number, and then 60% of this DTA number, and putting them together here as a combined number for that build. And at 40% DTH, 60% DTA, which is my guess kind of for general gameplay, but this of course shifts. This is also the issue with trying to get one value for something like this, is that there is no one value. cover this. This is dependent on what you're doing. If you're playing solo and you are just running around open world missions and such, you will likely have around 50% DTH, 50% DTA, maybe, because there's a lot more reds. The ratio of heavies and such, because they are usually fixed at spawn, and warhounds, for instance, and mini tanks and such will eat up that DTH a lot more. If you're doing heroic countdown, where everything is elite and they have a ton of armor and a lot more than their health, this number might be as high as 15% DTH and 85% DTA. If you're shooting at a raid boss and it's only basically mostly armor, because most of them are, then this number might be as high as 90% DTA, 10% DTH. This shifts with content. And even, for instance, going solo to a mission or going with a group to a mission, once you go into groups, the numbers of enemies doesn't... basically, when there's one player, it might spawn 5 enemies, but when there's 2 players, it might spawn 6, and it might swap 2 to them to be elite. That's basically how the game does it, because it can't do humongous waves. It can't go, if it's spawning for one person 5 enemies, it won't spawn 20 when it's 4 players. What it does instead is shift them up in their veterancy, as the game calls it, from going from reds to elites. So in 4-player content, you'll get a lot more elites, for instance, especially in the open world. If you play CPs on solo, it's a lot more reds and purples and a few elites here and there. And if you move on to 4-man CPs, they're basically all elites. So this number, you have to basically pick yourself, and with this calculator here, you can kind of do that. And even if you want input, of course, your own numbers, that's the value of these. You can basically copy this to your own drive and just alter anything that you want to alter from here. So let's first off go to the number where it is basically the break-even point, and that's 17. Actually, is it 18? I don't exactly remember. Might be. Are we going that way? Okay, it's 16 then. It is 15 then. As well. Okay, so on 15 we're below it still, and then likely when we go 14. Okay, so at 13 then we are actually exactly matching between the two numbers. So at 13 DTH, percent of the enemies being DTH, we would need 87% of DTA to be active. And this is very much what we usually recommend, not running contractors in a lot of content, because this, you will kind of hit this likely with for instance, heroic countdown, as I said before, or with raid bosses. But also there is another importance to DTA, which just this flat number will not provide you. And that is that the important enemies, the things that you really want to die, will likely be elites. Because if something is running around and they're a red, if it's just a red medic, you'll gun them down with this build, especially even in 4-man content, in 7-8 shots at most. If it's an elite medic and you really want it dead, then suddenly this DTA, this little 1.15% extra, is quite a little bit of a difference. It might mean 1 shot less, basically, and or 2 or 3, and especially on bosses, of course, and such. This, having a little bit more makes quite the difference. And that might be the reason to go contractors. And of course, as well, contractors fits in there, and it's crit chance, crit damage wise, it's landing actually on 59, the same that the weapon handling one does, of course, as well, leaving a little bit of that hole for a coyote. And for instance, even that extra 1%, so we're not even adding in, so let's say you only had the long range buff player alongside of you with your build, then we're already moving to 2% here. And of course, with the contractors as well, you can move it to be one more crit damage mod as well, especially for instance, and then shifting the balance even more. So just this flat number doesn't tell the whole story, and you do need to interpret it in a specific way. But also, for instance, it is important to then make note. It depends what you're fighting again. If you're fighting on a raid boss, let's say Boomer, that 1% may be the difference between your team getting through and not. If you're fighting Razorback, who's notoriously DTH, you're better off with that Fenris piece and just having, well, a lot more. Even there are elite enemies spawning there, but they're not the important thing. Well, nowadays, of course, everybody cheeses a Razorback. But if you're doing it like the old-fashioned way and just shooting at the damn thing and doing it in 4 phases or more, then yeah, this might make the difference. And this is very much, of course, yeah, this balance shifts and becomes also, yeah, the choice of, is it more important that I can kill elites fast, a little bit faster, if that makes the difference? And of course, again, this is not the comparison that actually will matter, for instance, for in my case, because the version that I am actually running is 59 crit chance, 183 crit damage, and if I alter those numbers, we can see that the Contractors is 3.5% above it. And now it actually does make quite a difference. Because yeah, with that crit damage mod there, then yes, they are pretty close to each other. And we take those numbers back. Here at the end of it, as well, of course, what I have is that I've made one as well with grade 23 at the ready. And if I shift it down a little bit more so we can see all of it. So it's the exact same thing, but now we've just added 23 grading to the weapon, and we are at, with the Fenris piece, we are at 163. So we're shifting the balance basically. And then we can see that the Contractors one, or when we put in the Contractor, it becomes even more beneficial to keep the Grupo and the third piece Providence and lose the Fenris basically. Because yeah, we've shifted that balance. And this is always the thing with build making in Division and all games that have multiple stats where you can kind of move around with one stat or the other, is once the balance shifts, you have to basically redo the calculations to get a feeling for it. Although, of course, what we could have surmised already from the other one, where Fenris was already losing out to that Grupo for being the choice to replace. If we add even more weapon damage, it's only going to get worse for Fenris. We could have surmised that already. And in the same way, we can surmise that if we add in a few blue cores, it will get better for Fenris. Although, of course, the break-even point, you would just need to calculate that out. And yeah, in that same way, it is still that this is very much around the same numbers. One thing I also wanted then to show as well is if we actually, so I'm going to swap this again to actually what I do run, which is 59,183 as my numbers with a weapon handling roll. And of course, those two builds aren't the exact same because yeah, one of them has basically a weapon handling roll as well. We can see that then yeah, even at 40%, they're pretty close to each other. And then actually at 30% here, I believe, is that Contractors already wins out against my choice, where I put that Fenris piece with a weapon handling roll and 3k chance mods on the weapon. So there, the choice between the two is a lot closer. But if you're going all out damage, what we can surmise to maybe actually move on to concluding in this video is what we can kind of surmise from these calculations is that the best setup, as somewhat seems to be, if we go crit chance, 2 crit chance mods, 1 crit damage mod on a weapon, letting us land on a flat 60. Although, of course, here we're not leaving a hole for for Coyote. And that is something that red builds, especially the place they get used, or high-end red builds, the place they get used the most nowadays is the raid. And in there, then it kind of matters that you will have actually several Contractors likely at the ready, active at the same time. And we could, of course, just have an extra hole here by just going from a crit chance mod on the weapon as well to crit damage. And that's actually what I quite often used to do is I'll go Contractors, I'll swap all of my crit damage mods on my weapon to be, or crit chance mods to crit damage mods, opening up a hole basically for Contractor or for Coyote to fill up. That's really my simple solution. And then if I need to as well, then actually if I take us into game, if I need to then as well, and there aren't enough Coyotes at the ready at that point, I would just equip my own and be the Coyote that the team then needs. And then, yes, I would just swap all this to be crit damage mods. And that's actually one of the easy ways to open a hole for Coyote, actually. You could, of course, alter your build to more cleanly fit that, although, of course, you would need a weapon with a long rail at that point. So usually I would keep this 5 crit chance here still, and letting us have 55 or 49 here, as it is here, with the Contractors, with the Coyote, which works out pretty fine. Or you could even still keep this crit chance, and you would land on a pretty clean 54, as we have it here. And yeah, all of these setups kind of work well, of course, and Coyote is a very strong piece to have, so you might as well make use of that one as well. And then basically, yeah, we are landing crit chance, crit damage on every of the Providence pieces as we have them here, although of course one of them could be a Grupo piece with the exact same brand bonus. We've left out Coyote in this discussion because Coyote is actually, it's a great piece, but it also makes calculating, you have to basically do every calculation in triplets for its triple buffs. And then also you have to have a discussion about which one do you feel that is going to be more active at what time. So we're leaving that discussion just to be, and we're just landing upon having, if we are going Contractors, we will have 3 crit chance mods here, and then have with these 3 crit chance mods and the Contractors and the Foxes, we will land on 59, 183. If we get a Coyote on top of it, fine. We still have even 1 crit chance here available for that Coyote to fill up in its mid-range. We would just gain crit damage bonuses anyway. If there's a good player with us that they have a lot of uptime on the mid-range one, we could swap one of these to be a crit damage. Or we could, if for maximum output, we wouldn't go this weapon handling, we would go crit chance, crit damage here. We would then grab 2 crit chance, 1 crit damage mod on the weapon for maximum output. And that output, just that 5 crit damage mod, does increase it just enough to be still worthwhile. The difference is minor, because yeah, this is already diminished to basically close to almost 1.5% at that point, as we saw from the calculations. But that's still 1.5% that you can squeeze out if you need it to be. And then, yeah, we would land on, in this case, we're landing on 54, 188. But yeah, if we had that 1 extra crit chance roll, we would have that ability. Although, of course, we could also use this as is if we're expecting a Coyote. And Coyote very much makes this a much longer discussion than it is here. And then we would take a secondary rifle because, yeah, we have a bonus for it. And this may seem familiar to a lot of players, especially if we go back to Contractors, with swapping out a Fenris or a Contractors to each other, having Fox, having 3-piece Providence, having a Grupo, having the option to put in a Coyote. That should seem familiar to a lot of long-time players as to these choices. But here we've gone through the numbers and backed up our choices. And that's usually what numbers are really for. You can go through them and really get a feeling of, okay, does it matter what I put here? Does it matter what Contractors that comes in? What stats should I go for? Do I have a hole with crit chance? Can I move that around and stuff? And here we have basically, if we're going to use that word, the optimal setup for, at least to me, for going between, for an AR build basically, is that I indeed go that Fenris glove with weapon handling or crit damage, for me at least. I like to have this weapon handling roll, then 3 crit chances here. And I can always swap this exactly 1-to-1 to this Contractors because, yeah, that weapon handling basically gets replaced by this damage to armor, so I don't even need to change anything on the weapons themselves. Because this then can always stay crit chance. And that is my choice to go with it. And then let's equip the grade 23 one as well. So that is kind of the thought process of how Glass Red came together and still does quite often. And I hope you somewhat found it informative. I rambled on for quite a bit, I feel. but hopefully all of it was at least somewhat worthwhile. As yeah, for my next video, actually, it's going to be the build showcase on the Hunter's Fury SMG, which actually is already has been recorded and is at the ready to follow this up in a few days. And that's mostly been done that way to give me a few days extra, basically, to work on the DPS calculation, or well, damage calculation of the game guide, in-depth guide. And that's going to be because I want to get that one right. And especially the damage calculation, of course, there's a lot of videos on it. I feel I can add some insights and such into it because yeah, we'll go through in the same way as with in-depth guides, just through basically the facts of the matter, and then move on to some of the insights that I feel that I can give out. And that's mostly as well because yeah, later on that will be then followed up by several videos afterwards with a burst DPS and sustained DPS and damage per mag in-depth guide, basically, where we will go into why and how we use burst and sustained DPS, as we've kind of done here as well today as well. So yeah, I very much you join me for those ones, or over on Twitch, where I'm also streaming daily nowadays. And as always, have a good night.